Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. We've got an incredible guest today, and I'm really excited for the insights and ideas they'll be sharing. There are so many practical learnings from the conversation that will make a difference to you, your team, or organization. If your organization is interested in a workshop on this topic of the podcast, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. If you want to support our podcast, and you'll find a link to our Patreon in the podcast description. Thanks in advance for listening and your support. Now, let's take a different path to success. Welcome to the Workplace Podcast. Joining us today to discuss organizational kindness is researcher and consultant Dr. Nicki Macklin, whose work explores how kindness strengthens professionalism, leadership, team, and organizational performance. A patient and family advocate and a former healthcare professional and manager, Nicki completed her PhD at the University of Auckland, examining organizational kindness as a form of social capital in complex systems. Through her consulting practice Kindframe, Nicki helps organizations and boards turn kindness into a practical tool for better decision-making, constructive dialogue, and accountable leadership. Her research and writing have appeared in BMJ Leader and Harvard Business Review. Nicki is a visiting scholar at the University of Toronto's Rotman School of Management, where she lectures on kindness and relational leadership. She collaborates internationally with leaders in law, healthcare, and business to create cultures that balance performance with humanity. Nicki, welcome to the Workplace Podcast.
Kia ora. Thank you for having me.
So, Nicki, I read your article on organizational kindness in the Harvard Business Review, along with your co-author and previous podcast guest, Amy Edmondson, who I'm a big fan of. And we have to mention your other co-authors then as well, don't we?
Yeah, so I had the good fortune of writing with two of my role models in this area. So Thomas Lee, who's also at Harvard with Amy, and Amy Edmondson, the one and only.
Yeah.
Lucky me.
Yeah, lucky you. I've the pleasure to meet her twice in person. I met her recently at Thinkers 50, and hopefully I think she's going to be a podcast guest in a couple of months' time again. And this notion of organizational kindness really captured my attention. So for our listeners then, what is organizational kindness?
Organizational kindness is really understanding kindness, not just at an individual level, but understanding that our behavior and the way that we can choose to express our values is impacted on by structures and systems and environments around us. So when I decided to do the PhD and I decided to really focus on that organizational kindness, it was a recognition from both past experience as well as our own treatment in the healthcare system as a family with a family member with complex medical needs, understanding that it's not as easy as just waking up in the morning and deciding that we're going to be the kindest person in the world every day, no matter the environment that we're in. And I think this is especially important, William, if we look at especially in healthcare, but also across different sectors like law and education, we are in a pickle. You know, post-COVID, there's a lot of pressure on us. There's limited resources. Social cohesion in wider society is eroding. And this is coming through into our work relationships as well. We're in a difficult environment, no matter our role or position at the moment. And really, no one is coming to save us anytime soon. So the organizational kindness kind of framing was acknowledging that for us as individuals to live out our values and to find meaning in how we're engaging with others, we need systems and structures behind us.
So how will this benefit an organization? Like, what is it for me if I'm a chief financial officer or I'm a senior leader? Like, this is like a nice to have, isn't it? Surely.
Oh, look, that soft and fluffy reputation is killing us, William. I've come up against it a lot and I'm still coming up against it. I think, for a lot of us leaders, we hear kindness and we think warm fuzzies and puppy dogs and kittens and perhaps some group hugs. And really, our cynics of kindness out there, they talk about how kindness is lowering our standards for performance and behavior. But actually, my PhD research showed quite the opposite. So kindness is about holding people to high standards, because we believe that these people that are working for us and with us are capable of meeting them. So again, the PhD was really challenging the assumption that kindness competes with performance or toughness, because it really doesn't. It's what makes toughness sustainable, and I think makes performance possible.
So how does an organization benefit from this? Is it standards, performance? Like what are the other factors involved that might entice me to consider organizational kindness for my organization?
So again, I think, we reference that organizations are facing sort of genuine pressures and increasing pressures. So across the board, across the world, we're looking at workforce reductions and increased demand and threats such as pandemics. And that's exactly when kindness becomes more critical, not less, because in these sorts of situations, that's when an organisation really needs people to stay and to perform and to go beyond what's been asked of them in their job descriptions, but also how they share information, how they spot problems before they become big disasters. And so we know from kindness science that's emerging, we can link it to some really hard organisational metrics. So we know that unkindness has compound costs. So in cultures where unkindness is kind of the standard, we see cultures where trust is eroded and the workforce is disengaged and good people leave. And that's a cost that you pay for as an organisation long after the immediate crisis passes. I think we referenced in the article, so there was a great study done with Fortune 1000 companies that looked at how much time middle to senior managers spend dealing with the fallout of incivility. It's 7 weeks a year. So that's 7 weeks per manager per year. And you think about crises, like how many could you actually prevent or resolve if you had that sort of time back in your day? And when we're looking at, even a medium-sized organisation, maybe you have 10 middle to senior managers, 10 times 7, William, that's 70 weeks a year lost in dealing with employee behaviour problems.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Yeah.
So I really look at this kindness work as being quite strategic for organisations. And the other thing that I love saying when I, give presentations or work with leaders in workshops or go and lecture, it's not if our organisations can afford to dedicate resource to kindness. It's can you afford not to when you're thinking about the turnover, absenteeism, things like that.
Yeah. So it's a strategic advantage. I'm hearing it's about productivity, it's about talent retention, it's about employee engagement, it's about productivity, it's about, the time wasted, managers' time wasted where they could be working on something strategic and it's wasting all that time to could actually be revenue generating, then revenue degenerating, if you want to call it that, because there's all these costs and time there.
Imagine, William, what you could do with 7 weeks a year back in your working year. Just imagine what kind of projects you could accomplish.
Well, the first thing I would do is I take more time off. But anyways, just on that. So you talked about incivility and unkindness, and you talked about employee behavior problems. So what is unkindness or incivility in the workplace? So for those of us who may not be familiar with these terms, or let's be more specific on that. What might that look like?
And look, let me have a stab at this, William, but I'd like to just shout this one from the rooftops. I did, as you know, I submitted my PhD last year. It was about 120,000 words on organisational kindness. I did not mention bullying once in that PhD. We used a very strongly appreciative inquiry approach.
Yeah.
But in saying that, most of our kindness research that's out there in the world that informed our own research is taken from a deficit space. So that incivility
Yeah.
and bullying work. So from me, I yes, there's a lot of workplace bullying out there. I think more pesky and perhaps more damaging is actually incivility. So again, studies have shown that 98% of us in the past year have experienced some form of workplace incivility. And this is not, someone giving you a wedgie in the corridor or someone stealing your lunch or calling you really offensive names. This is your garden variety rudeness. So it's, you're inside a ward handover and it's a nurse sniggering when you're handing over about a patient. It's when you're coming down the corridor in a law firm and your supervisor sees you and turns the other way or turns a cold shoulder or shuts the door on you. It's all those little kind of microaggressions that we see, the eye rolling, the excluding people in the lunchroom, microaggressions that actually, when they happen to us, we kind of go, did that really just happen? Like, am I being sensitive? Should I be offended at this? It's all that little stuff that over time builds up, and it's very quick to erode trust inside our relationships. It's really insipid. Incivility, so not bullying, that garden variety rudeness, has a huge impact in healthcare, for example, on avoidable mortality. It's that serious. So we're talking, a third of avoidable mortality inside surgical rooms can be drilled down to the root cause being incivility within the surgical team. It's really serious.
What a statistic. So the statistics we have so far are 7 weeks of lost time, of managers' time, plus a third of mortality rates could be reduced by addressing organizational kindness and incivility in the workplace. Now, speaking of that, we have an episode on this with Christine Porat.
What a guru.
I know, I have some wonderful guests here. So that's episode 81, Building a Community at Work with Christine Porat. Now, speaking, you just talked about mortality rates there. And people might be listening here to go, well, actually, I'm not in the healthcare profession. Is it just for healthcare professions, or is it for all environments?
All environments. And, I do have this healthcare background, so apologies, I tend to draw on that a lot in terms of the PhD, but actually most of my consulting work is taking place in law and business environments now. And so I had to do the work of translating across. Incivility has a huge impact on productivity. So not just, and this is a really scary thing, William, and this is, drawing from Christine Porat's work, it's not just productivity being impacted on as the recipient of incivility. So if you're the recipient of incivility, you might start taking more sick time, you might reduce your productivity, you're less willing to collaborate or share information with others, and that's a hangover that lasts long after the event itself. But really scarily, even our witnesses, so people who were not directly involved in that incivility, also suffer a decrease in productivity, time spent worrying about the relationship status of those at work, time spent worrying, is this someone that I can trust? That walking on eggshells feeling, I'm not sure if I can raise this or how they're going to take it, so maybe I'll just stay quiet. It's really serious. And as service users, so our clients, are really important in business and law and all sorts of settings. Our clients pick up on incivility between team members, and they become less likely to recommend that organisation to friends and colleagues.
So it hurts brands, it hurts revenues, absenteeism, all these things there. So we're really building this message to support this. And in the article, you mention about Microsoft's Satya Nadella, who says it fosters innovation, collaboration, and trust. And there's many organizations you've quoted in that article, like SAP and and that. Like, can you give us some examples as what they do? Because I know what Tina Della did. He did a listening tour at the start. You know, it's really that
Yeah.
role modeling that they did, was to say, listen, and you commented earlier on about a priesthood of inquiry there. So you might tell us a little bit about the practical things that other companies have done.
William, I have to honour my Kiwi roots here and actually use the All Blacks as my favourite example of this.
Yeah.
So you might laugh at this. Kiwis are known for somewhat dirty, scrubby language at times, even in professional settings. So we've all kind of got some issues with swearing from time to time and speaking in riddles and so forth. So apologies if any of this comes out, and please stop me if you need clarification around my turns of phrases or the accent. So we put the All Blacks into the article, a team close to my heart. HBR insisted I take the swear words out, but actually the All Blacks, if I'm allowed to mildly swear on your program, William, the All Blacks operate a famous policy called the no dips policy. And what that is a very explicit expectation of every player and every coach and every support worker within the All Blacks hierarchy to not put their ego on display. So to not be a dickhead. So hierarchy is flattened. You've got, your star players, they're the rainmakers and they're the ones that are going to score the tries, but they've still got to clean up the change room after. They've still got to roll up their sleeves and dig in with everyone else. And that's super important, but it's not just words on a poster with the All Blacks. It's really deeply embedded. And it's the same, if we're looking at Microsoft or Google or Cleveland Clinic, it's the same stuff. That it's not just words on a poster. The thing that sets these organisations apart, including the All Blacks, is that they have deeply embedded these values and these norms. So for the All Blacks, if someone, and I'm sorry that it's just the turn of phrase that is most appropriate, if someone acts like a dick, they're benched. They're benched for the game. So it doesn't matter if they're the star player. There's no permission to compromise other people's dignity or to show disrespect to anyone else in the wider team, no matter the position. And I think that's something that sets some of these organisations apart. Interestingly, William, something that's come up a few times since the HBR article, obviously these, if you're talking Microsoft, All Blacks, Cleveland Clinic, these are quite elite organisations and they have reasonably significant resources compared to your mid-sized firms. And so a kickback that's happened since the article, which I find really interesting, but also really useful to get out there in the open, is what about the mid-sizes, the ones that don't have the same level of resources? And how do you even, if you've got like a stretched middle manager in a small-sized firm, how do you operationalize this? Like you can't go the Microsoft way. You probably can't fund a listening tour. So what can we do? So I think this was a really important thing to start coming out of the PhD. And certainly I know Amy and Tom and I are all kind of flagging there are lots of smaller bite-sized actions that you can take. These organizations that were in the article, they didn't wake up suddenly one day and just decide to throw a bunch of money at building a positive culture. They witnessed the impact of some of their leaders, taking steps towards embedding kindness. They saw the positive impact. They saw the links happening between management style and team performance. They explored some of the research and went, you know what, this is what happens in high-performing organizations and we want this for ourselves. So it's not necessarily a question of resource. It's really, how can we start? There's an old saying, the way to eat an elephant is one small bite at a time. And without wanting to be patronizing, I think there's a little sprinkling of truth in this when we're thinking about how to start embedding kindness within our own kind of capabilities as a leader and perhaps with limited resources.
Yeah, I think you're right, because what was coming to me is, we'll say it's just a recession coming up, okay?
Yeah.
And they're going, listen, niceness is not a need to have, it's a luxury. Listen, we're all under pressure now. You know what? Just cop on, do your job. I don't want to hear about your drama at home or anything like that. You know what? Just get the job done. I am sick to my teeth. There's so much pressure coming on from up above. This is what people might be seeing, isn't it? In their own head, managers in a incivility environment or unkindness environment.
Yeah, and I like to kind of frame it as a bit of an unkindness tax, though. So again,
Yeah,
in my work with different leaders in different settings, something that keeps coming up again and again is this idea: I don't have time for
yeah,
kindness. Like I'm under pressure. We've got limited time. Our workflow doesn't allow for kindness, and I think it's not especially accurate. I think it's a misconception about what kindness really is, because as we can see from, we're talking the Fortune 1000 study that
yeah.
shows that 7 weeks a year per manager is lost to incivility. Unkindness is one of the things that's creating a time shortage. And so if you're partly responsible for a culture where people don't feel safe speaking up and problems are not getting caught early, thinking to Amy Edmondson's work here, these are the sorts of things that explode into crises that consume time. And again, if your turnover is high because the culture's toxic and you're constantly recruiting and onboarding
Yeah.
and covering gaps, this is a huge cost. You're micromanaging because there's no trust left in the environment. These stretch managers who are working 60-hour weeks, I would put money on it, William, that there's a significant portion of those extra hours is actually dealing with some of the consequences of unkindness. So the mediating of conflicts and
Yeah,
redoing work because communication was poor or decisions weren't communicated well,
yeah.
managing the fallout when someone quits. I hope you can pick up how passionate I get about this stuff. It's really important.
I think what you're saying is really what I want to speak about here today, because it's the unseen damage that is being done where we reward star performers for that unkindness, and then it's that corrosive damage that happens in the long term and the short term by creating all these different workload pressures, when if we managed and led in a different way, it would produce different results. You mentioned there about the practical things that we can do. Like, is there systems and structures that we can put into place? So we'll say leadership development programs, is there policies, or is there other processes that we can put into place to, I suppose, promote kindness in the workplace?
Yeah, there absolutely are. We covered some of them in the Harvard Business Review article, and we tried to kind of work our way through socio-ecological levels and really demonstrate how it's not enough to make a commitment at an individual level. You need to have the
Yeah,
systems and processes around you to support you. I think, and I'd see this time and time again when I'm working with leaders from all sorts of different
yeah,
industries, there's a couple of really important things to acknowledge. One is that in many of our professional domains, some of our older professions, again, like healthcare or law or education, when we become leaders within organizations based on, our professional role, identity, training, whatever you want to call it, when we are chosen to become leaders, many of us have not had any formal leadership training. So, you know, if you're a doctor, you're often promoted to a leadership role because you have had X number of years in that specialty area. You've demonstrated, this number of technical
yeah,
competencies. There's very little in some of our older style human resource procedures and organizational promotion work that acknowledges any of the social intelligence or emotional intelligence or what I like to call cultural intelligence that
yeah,
comes with being a leader. And so we don't do education well for our leaders in those specialized kind of industries. We're setting them up to fail when we don't promote
yeah.
based on at least some of those some of those professional competencies around emotional intelligence and stuff. So I think our medical education, legal education, professional education has a long way to go. I'm really heartened. I've been really enjoying learning more about the business curriculum at places like the University of Toronto. I'm heartened to see that they are dedicating resources to these ideas of relational leadership and conflict resolution, conflict mediation, dealing with difficult conversations. I think this is really important. I think it's really sad that for the most part we don't have that sort of education support in some of our major industries.
So, because I have to say, I'm a big believer in this myself. You can see the podcast is all about cultural intelligence here. It's about leadership. It's about conflict resolution. It's about mediation. So you'll see all these topics on the podcast. So education is one lever that the organization can do. Onboarding leaders then to support them, whether it's through mentoring or whatever, just to make sure that they're, I suppose, living the espoused values of the organization.
If we look at an individual level, so, in an ideal world, and when we're promoted to leadership, we've got this kind of keen sense of ourselves and who we are, and something actually, so I don't know if you've heard of him, there's a really cool New Zealander called Sir Ashley Bloomfield. He was our Director General during the COVID years, and he's fondly referred to here in New Zealand sometimes as Uncle Ashley. That's a real Kiwiism. Ashley Bloomfield taught me about this idea of meta values. So as a leader, we need to develop a keen sense of the values that are important to us. So that might be kindness, and of course I'm going to suggest that should be a value, but integrity, honesty, and we use these values to ground us and to inform our actions that not just that we expect in ourselves, but the sorts of actions that we would expect to see in others around us within the sort of workplace culture that we're creating. And so at an individual level, we can argue that we do have some ownership and control over our emotional regulation. More than that, and especially important with kindness, and something that's really dear to me is that we differentiate kindness from compassion, and we can come back to this if it interests you, but a cognitive commitment to acting in ways that reflect our own values and the actions that we want to see. So if you kind of spiral that out to trust, how is trust built in a workplace? And that's through a commitment to sort of a consistency, like stability and accountability, both our own as well as those that we work with. So, this consistency is, if this situation happens, you can rely on me to act in this particular way and to support you in this particular way. If you fail to meet deliverables or expectations, you can expect that as a consequence or reaction, this is the sort of, this is how I'm going to act, no matter what your position on the team is. So, in an ideal world, we would be teaching our leaders much more about how we know ourselves and our values and how we can be guided by those.
So I'm hearing about it could be done through mentoring or coaching. It could be done through performance reviews to say, listen, there's clarity of expectations there, and actually, you know what, there's consistency in my management and leadership here. Here's what you can expect if it falls below the standard here, and then there's consistency and follow through on that. So that's very much that system that anybody can implement there, isn't
That's
it?
right.
And it's that trust then as well. What does that explicitly mean then? So it's about getting clarity of expectations from everybody in the organization, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And that's, that is, well, regardless of how many resources you have or what kind of training you've had or, who's got your back, this is something that you can commit to at an individual level. So though I love talking organisational stuff, it is really important to not pass the buck, so to speak, onto, saying, well, my hands are tied. I'd love to work this way, but there's nothing I can do. That's not okay either. So, if we're thinking about how that translates into practical steps we can take at an individual level, we can think about, and let's, imagine we are a stretched middle manager working, 60-hour weeks, and we've got maybe 15 or 20 people underneath us. Let's imagine that. So what can a middle manager do within themselves, within their own locus of control? So we could think about how we respond to mistakes and other people's errors, and think about how we can be consistent in this. This is really important. Amy has written a lot around failing well. So next time someone makes an error, so before you react, take a breath and think, and ask them, what happened? Like, what did you learn? What support do you need to stop this happening again? How can I help you? And that doesn't cost anything, but it signals to the person involved that it signals psychological safety. It builds trust. They're like, hey, I can bring a mistake to this leader and they're not going to make it personal. And along that consistency, we can look at how we make our standards and expectations for behaviour really visible and consistent. So I think some of us, we avoid having these conversations because we don't want to be seen as unkind, but actually that's the niceness trap that we referred to in the article. So you can tell your team explicitly when this happens, here's how I'll respond. When you need help, here's what you can expect from me. If you deviate from our acceptable group norms, this is the reaction you can expect. I will be following up with you. So that predictability, that is kindness in the real world, I think, William. So it's creating an environment where people aren't walking on eggshells or wondering what version of their leader they're going to get today. That is something we can practice like a muscle. We can build that intelligence for ourselves.
And if people are interested more in failing well, I've interviewed Amy Edmondson, Professor Amy Edmondson there. It's episode 93, The Right Kind of Wrong. That's the title of her book. Now, speaking of relational leadership, then, sometimes people mistake what kindness is, and sometimes it's fluffy, it's hard to quantify. Is it a feeling? Is it compassion? Is it empathy? Like, what in your mind is kindness then?
Kindness is one of those terms that's sometimes best understood in the context of other similar words. So let's bring it back to kindness versus niceness, to really kind of understand the contrast. And again, because the nice trap is a really common trap, especially for our younger leaders. They think that they need to be friends with everybody as they're building their leadership. That is a massive trap and leads to a lot of role confusion and a reluctance to build the sorts of boundaries that actually generate real, authentic kindness. So if we're looking at niceness, so niceness is about avoiding discomfort. That's probably the simplest way we can put it. So niceness is about letting things slide, not wanting to ruffle any feathers, not wanting to hurt any feelings. You're not engaging in the hard conversations. You're trying very hard to stay agreeable. This is a side note, but I really dislike leadership research that lists agreeability as one of the key things that makes a good leader. I have to disagree with that. I don't think agreeability should be put on a pedestal. That's a side note. Kindness is quite the contrast. So kindness is about doing what's right even when it's difficult. So kindness means having the tough conversations, not to cut someone down to size, but because you believe that person can do better and you believe that your team deserves better than what's being put on display. So if someone on your team is consistently underperforming and you say nothing because you don't want to be unkind, that's not kindness. That's cowardice or niceness, sometimes dressed up as compassion. So the kind thing, and this is something that Amy, Tom, and I have all argued for, both in the article, but also, in the presentations that we give, the kind thing is actually, really strongly linked to honesty, to being direct, and to being respectful but firm about what needs to change.
I really like that, because it's not excessive niceness or being passive or unassertive or conflict averse, which can be a negative. It really is about being assertive, being firm, being true to your values, being very honest and direct. And I really like what you said there. You're disagreeing that agreeableness should be a major component of what leadership
One of the
is.
top 5, yeah.
Because this is myself and Luke Monaghan talk about when we talk about resolution intelligence. What is the problem you're trying to solve here, and what's the best way to navigate that? Okay, so one of the parts that we'll talk about later on is appreciative inquiry. But what I'd like to go to next is what you said at the start of the podcast. There, we talk about social capital, especially in complex systems, and how that makes a difference. Now, what is social capital and how does it make a difference there? So social capital, is it your reputation? Is it your brand? Like what is it's something you've built up over time? What is it?
Yeah, so this is where I wish that we had Tom Lee in the room with us. So social capital, as I understand it, and I have learned from the best, Thomas Lee is kind of the authority on this stuff. Social capital is the magic that happens inside relationships. So, William, when we talk about capital in an organization, we've got financial capital that's fairly self-explanatory. We have human capital, and that is, the right people with the right skills and the right job. Social capital goes beyond that, because actually, you can have the right people with the right skills and the right job, but they're still not talking to each other or collaborating or information sharing in a way that leads to innovation or reduces efforts, like replication of efforts. So social capital is the magic that happens inside relationships. It's how we work together. It's really strongly tied in, like psychological safety and kindness, to trust and respect for one another. It's around how we operate as a group. So what are our healthy group norms? I know you've had Vanessa Druskat on your podcast. Huge fan of her work. I really love her research around how we build healthy group norms. Social capital is a little bit like that. So it's an acknowledgement that it's not enough to be the right person. A team is not a high-performing team due to these bright individuals. It's actually, you can have a high-performing team without any rainmakers in the team. It's much more important how people are working together to collaborate. So social capital is not just within your team. It's also across teams, within organizations, across organizations. So we can have social capital at a more of a community and government level. How are our government agencies talking to each other? How are they willing to work together? How are we collaborating in a way that minimizes the unnecessary spend of resources and so forth? So it's really key.
So another topic you talked about is relational leadership there. And I just want to, I suppose, get your insight into this. So if I'm a leader listening in here, I probably listen to other leadership podcasts, say with Cara Kaufman or whoever I've interviewed on that topic. What is it for you is relational leadership, and how will it make a difference to kindness in an organization?
Yeah, so relational leadership, I think there's quite a sort of well-defined lens that kindness can put over relational leadership education. And I think that's one of the reasons why, the time in Toronto with Rotman has been so productive and impactful. So I think probably the easiest way for me to try and unpack this is through a side issue actually that comes up often with kindness, especially, talking to different cultures here in New Zealand, we have quite a unique multicultural society, and we have a very strong commitment and relationship with our Indigenous culture and language. This changes over time, and something that comes up when I speak around kindness is this idea that there are cultural and generational differences with kindness. And this seems a bit waffly, but I will come to the point. So a fundamental principle from the PhD research that I did is that one of the key defining characteristics of kindness as compared to related concepts like empathy and compassion and niceness is that real kindness is other-centered. So to explain that a little bit more, it's not so important how it feels to show kindness. It's not really defined by the internalized process of deciding to act kindly. That's not its benefit or its impact. The impact happens in how it's judged and perceived by the other's experience of receiving it. So kindness is judged by how it lands. This is in quite a stark contrast to some of the other terms out there like compassion and again, bugbear, we talk about compassionate leadership, empathic leadership, kind leadership. They're all subtly different ideas. So compassion is very much emotional. It's an internalized response to someone else's suffering. This makes it a self-centered process. So in fact, a lot of researchers don't even try to link their definitions of compassion with observable actions because the focus is so very much on the internalized engagement in another person's suffering. That's what makes it distinctive. So the fact that kindness is other-centered actually helps us to navigate relational complexities and cultural differences rather than making it more difficult. So if we can unpack this a little bit more, and William, I talk 90 to the dozen, so please stop me if I'm going too far, I'm talking too long. If we think about kindness as being about the recipient's experience, so, being kind in a multicultural environment or an environment where there are differences present, and I'm yet to encounter a workplace where there aren't, vast differences between the workforce characteristics. So kindness is about asking, what does this person in front of me need to feel respected, to feel valued, to feel supported, rather than what would I want in this situation, which is perhaps a more empathic or compassionate response. So, for example, something that has come up in a talk I gave, I had a leader who was German in the room, and I had been talking about the importance of giving direct feedback and specific feedback. And he had said, well, to some members on this team, when I do give direct feedback, I'm accused of not being kind. Whereas I think I'm being clear so that you know exactly where you stand. But it turned out actually the issue, so there were a couple of Japanese team members in the team, and they interpreted this leader's approach as being quite humiliating and disrespectful. And again, if we're thinking about kindness, it's how it lands with the other person. So the kind approach in this situation is not judging by your own standards, but asking, how does this person in front of me receive feedback best? So what is the cultural context or, religious context or whatever other differences there are? What is the context that they're operating in? And then adapting your approach. So I don't know if I'm making much sense, but, there's some universal elements of kindness that transcend culture and relationships. So, we're thinking kindness is about being treated with dignity and respect. It's how our contributions are acknowledged by those, in leadership positions. It's being given the right information that we need to do our job properly. It's being supported, having concerns taken seriously. So that is kind of universal, right? So across cultures, this is something that our research has found, at least, that this is really important to pretty much all people. But what varies is the how, so the specific behaviours that we engage in and choose that help communicate those things. So it's not, in this team, we all show eye contact. Because if you're neurodiverse or from some cultures, that might be quite intimidating. It's actually, instead of saying you must, make eye contact with every guest every time, it's you must show that when you're engaged with someone, you're fully present and listening. And I think that we bring this into our relational leadership. So when I think about relational leadership, it's kind of quite closely tied into leading across differences. So how we choose our actions and consider the other person's context in order to make our actions land in the right way, that for the other person, that shows respect, that shows dignity, that shows that we are invested in helping them to grow and develop.
And as I was listening to you, then I see there's a big overlap with appreciative inquiry then, because then you're asking questions to try to appreciate where they're coming from, and it's that others focus then is where are you coming from, what's your personality, what's your religion influences, your culture and influences, your upbringing. There's lots of different ways to have that appreciative inquiry.
I think, William, this might be your turn to shine. So your LinkedIn post this morning, with the questions that you ask when you're coming into teams, I think they were amazing and perfect, and certainly in my own work with teams, they're very close to what I would use to draw people out of themselves, to understand from me what matters to them, but also for them to understand as a team what matters to each other. So there's this motto that I kind of use when I'm working with different teams, and I encourage them to uptake it as well, as kind of along the lines of what matters to you, but if it matters to you, it matters to me. And so here's your turn. So your questions, can you?
So I'll just elaborate on that. So I did a post because I was writing an article for a newspaper, or should I say, contributing to an article in a newspaper, and myself and my colleague Luke Monaghan have coined the concept of resolution intelligence, right? So the trademark hopefully is out next week, and resolution styles then is as a part of that. How do we resolution intelligence is what is it that we are here to resolve? And we talk about resolve as the first solution didn't work. So what are the range of solutions? And it's underpinned by mediation principles. So we have the different orientations, there's different lenses that we see things through, which is the people lens, which is the accommodator that's making space for all. We have the collaborator where, listen, we're in this together. So that's the people lens. And it's that psychological safety is there, but it's also the accommodator say, how do I accommodate to your needs? And then you're kind of going, well, what's the process there? So the facilitator that is choosing the right process, whether it's like mediation or whether it's we have an external facilitator to come in, or then we have a negotiator that comes in to say, listen, what's the optimal outcome here? So how do we compromise in the needs? So again, it's underpinned again by negotiation principles, and especially that integrative one, which is hopefully the win-win, or we get most out of the expanding the pie there. And then you have the last part, which is progress. So a lot of people get stuck in conflict, and really what it is the solution side of things is the fixer. What are the full range of options available to us? And especially, I love this concept of the both and mindset. How can we get what we both want? And then the driver is the last element of those styles. Then in the progress orientation, then is how do we deliver on the results? How do we land the plane here? How do we actually be accountable, as you were saying here, to get that results? And then what I haven't mentioned in the article is what you've actually did. We've a behavioral reports designed on this, so it's like a psychometric. Now we're going through the technical paper on this, so we can't call it a psychometric yet. And what we actually have, which you might be interested in, Nikki, is the others focus. Are you self-focused or other focused? And that's what you really want to get across is that are you being excessively nice in that? Because there's a shine and shadow to all of these behaviors. Because if you're too much of a driver, you're driving the results home. Or if you're too focused on the others, then you're excessively nice, because that link to your accommodator, which might be high, and there's a shine and shadow to that. And this is where that appreciative inquiry come in. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to shine there. I think this is where we have to shift the focus to ourselves sometimes, and sometimes it is about, if I am a leader, Nikki, and this is where you might come in, is what are the warning signs here that I might be unkind there? What do you think? Because sometimes people say, oh, this is just a soft skill, but I think you make the argument that it's a hard skill.
Oh, yeah. Do you know, this probably comes up the most. So sometimes I do kind of a range of different services, and sometimes I'm working with teams and an appreciative inquiry. They're already awesome, but, they're wanting a refresh, it's maybe the start of a new year, and they want to, remember how awesome they are and remind each other, what it is that they do so well and what they want to keep doing moving forward. So maybe it's setting New Year's resolutions as a team, so forth. I love that work. But there's another side of the work that's actually being put in as an outsider facilitator when things are not going well. So when leaders have either come into a new team or they're struggling with difficult personalities, or, kind of drowning in the toxic culture, or not being sure how to be kind and still maintain positive group norms and pull people into line that need pulling into line. And so that's kind of a more discreet side of the service that I do, but it's where a lot of the learning is. So though it's not, strengths-based or strengths-focused, there's this learning that may be quite interesting for some of your listeners here around, and it's a question that keeps coming up, is how do you be kind to everybody? So, if we take the simplistic view of kindness, and again, this is really common in a lot of business and law environments and medical environments. What do you do when your rainmaker or your top biller is also the biggest arsehole in the room? How do you, because they're meeting organizational objectives, and there's this tension there, we have, as leaders, we have to keep coming back to purpose, and our purpose is to serve teams in a way that benefits the organization to kind of the maximum amount, right? So we are guiding our teams towards organizational purpose. It's often tied into those really hard metrics around productivity and stuff. So what do you do with those top earners that are also giant assholes? And so that when I was, when I was just kind of stepping into this work, I really struggled with this space, but actually it's become a lot easier. And I think it may be worth just kind of referencing here. So there's been a few situations where I've worked with teams to kind of put in place these group norms and put some accountability around what behaviours they need to see out of that giant asshole, what they need to see change. You can offer the support. You can flag to them that there's a gap between what they're giving in terms of relationships and where they need to be. Now, eventually, with some, you end up getting to a point where you're flogging a dead horse. They kind of know that they're a top biller. They know that there's some protection around that. And I think a lot of the time they don't believe that there's going to be any sort of follow through. So I've worked with firms who, having worked with them to create these interventions and provide advice around supporting the person to make better choices and to build more positive relationships, that have ended up terminating these people's employment. Now, if you have kind of this superficial take on what kindness is, you can go, well, gee, Nikki, that's not very kind advice. But actually, so these people are number crunchers. If you're looking at organizational metrics and you're going, well, we've got to keep that top biller, you need to translate this stuff into numbers. And so, you sit with them and you go, okay, well, how much above average is that top biller bringing into your organization? And they're usually pretty clear on, giving you a kind of fixed amount, oh yeah, they're like 200K up on the next person. That's really cool. But then actually, let's put them in context. So of their 10-person team, how many of that team are performing at the average level expected for people in this firm in terms of productivity what's their absenteeism like compared to the norm? What is the retention rate like?
Yeah.
Without fail, these rainmakers at the top, without, the relational leadership skills that we've been talking about, they have teams that are underperforming. They have teams that, people stay 3 months and they go. So these organizations are putting all that money into recruitment and onboarding and building people up, and people are leaving. People are, filling out those personal grievances and creating these HR nightmares. And once you kind of sit down with these organizations and you do a bit of that kind of multi-layered math with them, it becomes a lot easier. And, sometimes the kindest thing you can do for an individual like that is to say, you know what, you're not the right fit. These people are often miserable themselves. You're not the right fit. You're not, we can't make this work. We've given you the support. Often down the track, you'll see these people thriving and, building positive relationships for a change in environment. But what you're doing is you're creating the space required for other people to shine. And these organizations are almost always actually better off financially for doing what is required.
I really wanted to get into that because that's where in the article you talk about metrics and benchmarking, your organizational kindness and the difference that it makes. Is there anything else? And then we'll make this the last podcast question. How about that? So benchmarking then, how do I benchmark? How do I know if my organization is kind or not? And what are the things that might inform me to say, you know what, we've got a problem here, or you know what, this is something we should actually celebrate because this is part of our unique value proposition or employee value proposition.
Yeah, and William, this is like the real show me the money question. So I'm glad that we're getting to it before we round things off, because this is actually where we need to get really pragmatic. So if you're a CFO or a COO, you want to know if your investment in kindness training or culture improvement is going to work. So it's really important for these people to understand what's the timeline on the return of investment, and at what point do you know if it's working or not. So out of this sort of uncertainty, almost every presentation, there's someone that asks, so what measure do you use? What is a kindness measure you can recommend to our organisation? And there are a few coming out, and in our HBR article, Tom, Amy and I argued that actually, there's not really a good one yet, one that's completely fit for purpose across any sort of organisation. And I think here's a great place to just really hammer home. Kindness measures aren't perfect, and I would say that we don't actually need them. We've already got a host of good interrelated measures that are available. We don't need to invent a new wheel, and we certainly do not need to add to the measurement saturation and fatigue that's in our organisations at the moment. So I'd say, William, we just need to get a bit smarter about how we look at the metrics that we already do well in most organisations. So we're already tracking a lot of data that tells a kindness story if we connect the dots, and the science is there to support that. So we can look at exit interviews and turnover rates. So, if people are leaving and saying, my manager didn't support me, or I hated the people I worked with, or, the leader treated people really unfairly or inconsistently, that's your kindness data. And we know that this turnover has a concrete cost, and it's a big one. We can look at our engagement surveys that a lot of organisations do. So questions like, do you feel respected? Do you feel that you have the support that you need? These are already measuring conditions that we would associate with kindness. And we've talked a bit about, sick leave and absenteeism. So again, if there's high rates of absenteeism or sick leave, that's a great indicator that something is going wrong. We can look at error rates. So Amy's work with psychological safety is awesome for this. And I use this a lot in my work with my teams, especially in healthcare. So one of the first questions I ask when I work with a new team is, So tell me what your adverse event reporting rates are like for the last year. Tell me, how many near misses have you had? And when I get a leader that says, no, like they never happen. No, that's not the problem. We never have those. Then that is a massive red flag. So, and this is backed up by Amy's research. So teams that are reporting more errors, they're not making more mistakes. They're in environments where it's safe to admit them. And it's not until we admit them that we can address the root cause of them and come up with strategies to minimize them moving forwards. We can look at customer satisfaction. Christine Porras' research around, service user perspectives on the health of organisations. And again, in healthcare, so our patient experience data and our employee experience data, they track almost perfectly together, as Press Ganey's research shows. We can look at things like the time spent in conflict, managers' experiences of how much time is taken up sorting out employee relationship disputes. So I guess out of this, and just to summarise, because I know time's ticking on, we don't need a new kindness score. We can create a dashboard, if you like, for kindness by connecting metrics that we're already tracking well. And when we can look at these things holistically, we can see patterns. So, high turnover clusters with high sick leave, low engagement, poor feedback. That already tells you everything you need to know about the relational environment. And again, just, a word of caution in terms of surveys. I've worked with organisations where they're all about multiple surveys. They want to get their staff involved. They send out these surveys. Surveys can lead to less trust if people are raising concerns that they perceive are falling on deaf ears. So cynicism really sets in if employers are giving their organisations the information about their concerns and organisations are perceived not to act. So, if an organisation is asking about respect and then people see no action, that has a huge negative impact on your organisational culture and that's probably the converse of what you're trying to achieve.
This has been so insightful and practical, Nicki. It has been such a pleasure to speak to you. If people were to find out more about you and what you do in organizational kindness, how might they do so?
Well, it's been a joy, William, and I have to thank you because you have let me go 90 to the dozen on all of my favourite topics. I've talked far too much, and so I can only hope that your listeners have enjoyed the Kiwi accent along with the content, because they've had a lot of it. If people want to find me, I'm very easily kind of accessible and really keen to connect on LinkedIn, just under Nicki Macklin. I do have a website which is hopelessly wordy, like me, and a little bit out of date, but kindframe.co.nz. And yeah, I would encourage your listeners, any curiosities they have, or I would love to continue the conversation.
Nicki, thank you so much for this conversation and thanks for coming onto the Workplace Podcast.
Thank you, William. What a delight.
Thanks so much for listening to the Workplace Podcast. I really appreciate you being part of the conversation. If you found value in today's episode and want to support what we're building here, you'll find a link to our Patreon in the description. As a workplace expert, I'm here to help you resolve your workplace dilemmas. If your organization could benefit from my expertise, feel free to get in touch via our website, yellowwood.ie. Yellowwood, your external learning and development partner. Take a different path to success in your career, leadership, team, and organization. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you soon.